Donald Trump receives an unexpected invitation from Pope Francis for a private conversation, no cameras, no crowds, just a quiet exchange. What the Pope gently shares in this intimate moment doesn't merely challenge Trump as a president, it reshapes him as a person. On a serene Wednesday evening in the White House, a sealed envelope arrived. The stationery was refined, the paper thick, bearing the unmistakable Vatican seal. It was delivered directly to Trump by an aide who withdrew silently, sensing the message was meant for private unveiling. Alone in the Oval Office, Trump held the envelope for a moment, curiosity tinged with a hint of confusion. He carefully broke the seal and unfolded the letter. The handwriting was elegant yet personal, as if written with deliberate thought rather than formality. It was from Pope Francis himself. The letter opened simply, devoid of formalities or preamble. "Dear President Trump," it read, "I invite you to join me at the Vatican for a private conversation. This meeting will require no official ceremony or press coverage. I ask only for a quiet dialogue, far from cameras and microphones. If you find this agreeable, my office will handle the necessary arrangements." Trump leaned back in his chair, the letter still in hand. He had met Pope Francis before, of course, formal occasions marked by diplomatic handshakes, rehearsed remarks, and carefully curated smiles. But this was different, personal, almost intimate. It felt as though the Pope was inviting him to a kind of discussion he had never truly experienced. Trump reread the letter twice more. There was something about its simplicity that struck him. This wasn't political posturing or a publicity stunt. It was a genuine request for an honest conversation, a rarity in his life. He reached for the phone on his desk, dialed his chief of staff, and spoke briefly but decisively. "Arrange the meeting with the Vatican," he said. "No press, no publicity, just set it up quietly." The days passed swiftly. The staff maintained discretion, and plans fell into place seamlessly. Trump boarded Air Force One on a bright, clear morning. Despite the absence of press briefings or public statements, he sensed curiosity among his aides. He knew they wondered why the Pope had summoned him to Rome and what this meeting might signify. The flight was unusually calm. Trump spent much of it gazing out the window, lost in thought. He pondered what the Pope might wish to discuss. There were countless possibilities, but none felt quite right. He had a sense he was heading towards something he couldn't predict or control, a feeling that was both unsettling and strangely comforting. Upon arriving in Rome, the Vatican arranged for transport directly to a modest private guest house near the Vatican Gardens. The accommodations were simple, tranquil, far removed from the grandeur typically associated with diplomatic visits. There were no crowds, no entourage, just quiet efficiency and a deep sense of reverence. Late that evening, a soft knock came at the door. Trump opened it to find a young priest standing respectfully, hands clasped. "His Holiness will meet you now, Mr. President," the priest said softly. Trump nodded and followed him through silent corridors and lush gardens to a simple room in the Apostolic Palace. Sunlight streamed gently through tall windows, illuminating the polished wooden floor and modest furnishings. Pope Francis stood calmly by the window, gazing toward the gardens. He turned as Trump entered, his expression warm and welcoming, free of pretense or judgment. They exchanged a brief but warm handshake. Trump noticed Francis held his gaze a moment longer than most, a subtle sign of sincerity and gravity. "I appreciate that you came," the Pope said quietly. "Please, sit with me." They settled into two plain chairs facing each other. For a moment, neither spoke. Pope Francis seemed at ease in the silence, patiently gathering his thoughts. Finally, he broke the stillness with gentle clarity. "I invited you here because I have been watching you," the Pope began, "not politically, but personally, your eyes, your face, when you speak, when you listen, when you stand before others. It has become clear to me that you are a man burdened by expectations, many of which you place upon yourself." Trump listened intently, unsure whether to respond. Instead, he waited, curious about where this would lead. Pope Francis continued, his voice soft yet firm. I understand that leadership carries a heavy weight. We both know this. But the true weight is never in the power or even the responsibility. It lies in how we see ourselves, in who we truly believe we serve. Trump's gaze dropped slightly. He hadn't anticipated this kind of conversation. He had expected something political or diplomatic, but this was far more personal, prompting reflection in a way he rarely allowed himself. "Let me ask you something," Francis said gently, leaning forward slightly. "And please, answer honestly, not for me, but for yourself. Who do you believe you truly serve? Not as the President of the United States, not as a businessman, but simply as Donald Trump." The question lingered softly in the air. It wasn't aggressive or critical, it was earnest. Trump swallowed, feeling a rare vulnerability. "I serve my country," he said finally, his voice quieter than usual, tinged with uncertainty. The Pope smiled kindly. "Of course you do. But beyond that, deeper still. When all titles and roles are stripped away, who do you serve? It's a question we all must answer eventually." Trump fell silent again, lost in deep thought. He had been asked countless questions by interviewers, politicians, and journalists, but none like this. The Pope wasn't seeking an answer for the world to hear. He was asking Trump to listen to his own heart, perhaps for the first time in years. Pope Francis leaned back slightly, his posture relaxed. "You don't have to answer right away," he said softly. "Sometimes, when we're asked the right question, it changes how we see everything." Trump nodded slowly, feeling the weight of the moment's sincerity. They spoke further about smaller things, moments from their pasts, times when both men felt unseen, when pride or ambition nearly blinded them. It was a conversation unlike any Trump had experienced before, open, honest, devoid of expectations or agendas. There was nothing political or strategic about it. Just two men, both leaders in their own way, speaking about humility, compassion, and what truly matters in the end. As the sunlight outside began to fade, Pope Francis stood, signaling a gentle end to their talk. "Think about this question," he said kindly. "Carry it with you. Let it speak to you. Sometimes the most powerful answers don't come immediately." Trump stood and shook his hand once more. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I think I needed this." Pope Francis smiled gently. "We all need it sometimes," he replied, placing a brief, reassuring hand on Trump's shoulder. "Go in peace." Trump walked back through the gardens, reflecting on their exchange. His steps felt different, lighter, yet heavier with a new understanding. The Pope's quiet dignity had struck a chord, opening doors Trump had long kept closed. As he boarded Air Force One to return home, he sat quietly, watching Rome recede into the distance, knowing he had encountered something profound, something that would begin to change him, not in a dramatic public way, but slowly, privately, and inevitably. Some conversations weren't meant for headlines, they were meant to make a person pause, reflect, and perhaps see themselves clearly for the first time. The return flight from Rome to Washington felt unusually long, despite the clear weather and smooth skies. Trump spoke to almost no one on board Air Force One, sitting mostly in silence, mulling over the conversation he just had with Pope Francis. Even at 30,000 feet above the Atlantic, the quiet intensity of their exchange stayed with him. "Who do you believe you truly serve? Not as the President of the United States, but simply as Donald Trump." The question replayed in his mind repeatedly. He had navigated countless interviews, political battles, and public disputes, but nothing had shaken him quite like these softly spoken words in a private Vatican room. It was as if the Pope had gently, without judgment, knocked him off balance, leaving him searching for solid ground. When Air Force One landed at Andrews Air Force Base, Trump's team immediately sensed a change. He disembarked more slowly, more thoughtfully, offering quiet nods rather than his usual enthusiastic waves. His staff exchanged curious glances, unsure how to interpret this subtle shift. He avoided their eyes, lost in thought, heading straight to his motorcade. That evening, in the private quarters of the White House, Trump wandered the quiet corridors. Typically, he'd turn on the television or scroll through his phone, seeking news about global politics or media coverage. Tonight, he did neither. Instead, he found himself standing silently by a window, gazing at the illuminated grounds. He had always loved this view, powerful yet serene. But tonight, it felt different, as if he were seeing it for the first time. The next morning, routine pulled him back to reality. Briefings resumed. Aides arrived with thick folders filled with intelligence reports, economic analyses, and policy proposals. Yet Trump struggled to give them his full attention. Staff began to notice he was more reserved, less reactive. Instead of making quick, definitive statements, he now often paused, considering his responses carefully before speaking. They assumed he was simply tired from the trip. No one suspected the true reason for his distraction had nothing to do with jet lag. Days turned into weeks, but the Pope's question continued to echo quietly within him. Trump found himself reflecting on it in the most ordinary moments, while signing documents, waiting in hallways before meetings, and especially late at night, when silence pressed against the White House windows. One evening, Ivanka visited him privately. They sat in the Oval Office, away from prying eyes and microphones. She immediately sensed something was troubling him. "You've been quiet lately," she said softly. "Is something wrong?" He hesitated, unsure how to articulate his thoughts. Finally, he nodded slowly. "I had a conversation with the Pope," he admitted quietly. "He asked me something I can't shake. He asked who I think I truly serve, not as president, but as myself." Ivanka smiled gently. "And what did you say?" Trump shook his head slowly. "I didn't answer. I couldn't. Honestly, I'm still not sure." Ivanka reached out and touched his hand softly. "Maybe that's why he asked. Sometimes the questions we can't answer right away are the ones we need to think about the most." Over the next few days, Trump's approach to meetings and public events began to shift subtly. He became more attentive, interrupting others less often, and displaying greater patience. At cabinet meetings, he started asking his advisors genuine questions, not rhetorical or challenging ones, but ones that showed he truly wanted to hear their answers. This new demeanor, though subtle, was noticed by everyone present. It was during a routine press briefing a week later that the first hints of more noticeable change emerged. A reporter, sensing something different in the president's behavior, asked directly, "Mr. President, has something changed for you recently?" Trump paused for a moment, looked directly at the journalist, and spoke with unusual candor. "Sometimes you have conversations that make you see things differently. I had one recently. It reminded me that being president isn't just about decisions or headlines, it's about listening. Even when you think you already have the answers." An unusual silence settled over the room. Reporters scribbled furiously, trying to capture every nuance of this unexpected moment of reflection. That evening, Trump sat alone in his office. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a notebook he rarely used. On the first page, he wrote the Pope's question exactly as he remembered it: "Who do you believe you truly serve?" Not as the President of the United States, but simply as Donald Trump. Beneath it, he began listing names, people he knew, people who mattered, and even those he had barely noticed before: housekeepers, aides, gardeners, the quiet figures who moved through the White House daily. Soon, he noticed a pattern. Each person he listed was someone he had either overlooked or undervalued: ordinary people. Without titles or headlines. With quiet unease, he realized he barely knew their names or anything about their lives. The next day, Trump surprised his staff by requesting an informal lunch with some of the White House's lesser-known workers: gardeners, maintenance staff, kitchen workers. The request puzzled his aides, but it was quickly arranged. As Trump sat at a long dining table in the White House kitchen with a dozen employees, everyone present was visibly nervous. But as he began asking simple questions about their families, lives, and challenges, the tension soon melted into sincerity. They shared stories of struggling to make ends meet, of early morning bus rides, of getting their kids to school. Trump listened intently, genuinely surprised by how little he understood about the lives of those around him every day. One woman, an elderly housekeeper named Maria, quietly shared her pride in serving at the White House, though no one ever noticed her. "I clean your office every evening," she admitted shyly, "and I often pray quietly for your strength." Trump swallowed hard, moved by her honesty. "Thank you, Maria," he said softly. "I didn't know, but I do now." After the lunch, Trump quietly asked his chief of staff to arrange better transportation options, childcare assistance, and small salary adjustments for some of the lower-level staff. There was no public announcement, no press release, no photo opportunity, just a quiet, compassionate act born of newfound awareness. Returning to his office later that day, Trump pulled out his notebook again. Beneath the Pope's original question, he wrote a brief answer, meant only for himself: "Perhaps I serve best when I remember who matters most." That night, for the first time in years, he went to bed with a feeling he hadn't experienced in a long while, a sense of quiet peace. Not from accomplishments or public recognition, but from finally glimpsing a purpose deeper than power or acclaim. He didn't know how he would continue to change, or how lasting this shift would be. But as he closed his eyes, he was certain of one thing: the Pope's quiet question had opened a door within him that wouldn't easily close again. Sometimes real change doesn't come from dramatic gestures or loud speeches. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in moments when someone speaks truthfully enough to make you listen to yourself. For Donald Trump, that moment of quiet listening had just begun. In the days following the understated lunch with White House staff, Trump's behavior in meetings with foreign leaders continued to shift subtly but noticeably. Once dominated by strategy and power plays, these interactions now included moments of genuine questioning and patient listening. Even his cabinet members began exchanging puzzled glances, quietly noting that something in him had softened. Some saw it as an improvement, others privately wondered if it signaled deeper changes in his presidency. One day, Ivanka visited his office again, sensing this wasn't just a fleeting mood. "Dad," she asked cautiously, "what exactly did Pope Francis say to you?" "Whatever it was, it seems to have really struck a chord." Trump looked up from the briefing papers scattered on his desk and leaned back thoughtfully. "He didn't lecture me or tell me how to lead," he said after a moment. "He asked who I serve when no one's watching. He made me think about what happens to the people who don't make headlines, who don't have power. And then I realized how often I've been blind to them." Ivanka smiled gently, recognizing something significant in her father's expression. "That's powerful," she said quietly. "Maybe that's the best kind of leadership, being able to see the people others forget." The thought stayed with Trump, taking root. He recalled Maria, the quiet housekeeper who had confessed to praying for him each evening. He couldn't shake the image of her silently cleaning his office, whispering an unnoticed prayer for his well-being. It was humbling. The next day, Trump quietly asked an aide to bring Maria to his office. When she arrived, she stood nervously by the door, clearly unsure why she had been summoned. Trump smiled warmly, gesturing to a comfortable chair. "Maria," he began softly, "I wanted to thank you personally for what you said at our lunch. It means more to me than you can imagine." Maria hesitated briefly, then stepped forward and sat carefully. "I didn't mean to bother you, Mr. President," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You didn't bother me," Trump assured her. "You reminded me. Sometimes I get so caught up in the noise, the power, the constant decisions, that I forget to see the people around me clearly." She nodded slowly, visibly touched by his honesty. "We all forget sometimes," she replied softly. "That's why I pray. It reminds me someone greater is always watching over us, even when we think no one notices." Trump felt a lump rise in his throat. "Maria, how can I help you?" "Thank you for reminding me." She hesitated, clearly unaccustomed to being asked such a question, especially by the president. Finally, she said quietly, "I have family in Guatemala." They're struggling so much. All I ask is your prayers for them." Trump nodded solemnly, struck by her selflessness. "You have them," he said softly, "and you have my promise to help however I can." After Maria left, Trump spent a quiet hour alone. His aides noticed the door remained closed, a rarity for a typical workday, but no one disturbed him. During that hour, Trump reflected deeply on the responsibilities of his office, not just in politics or economics, but in the quieter, more profound aspects of leadership. He realized anew how often he had overlooked those who mattered most. What Maria shared wasn't political or strategic, it was simply human, and that made it all the more powerful. In the days that followed, Trump's newfound awareness began to manifest tangibly throughout the White House. Staff started receiving thoughtful notes expressing his gratitude for their unseen work. Policies around wages, housing, and educational support quietly shifted to better recognize those often overlooked: veterans, single parents, low-income families. These changes didn't make headlines, but they were real, deeply felt by those they impacted. Word of this spread quietly through the White House corridors, not through memos or announcements, but through whispers and smiles shared among staff who felt seen for the first time. Trump's subtle actions created ripples of change, prompting those around him to reconsider their own leadership styles. At another closed cabinet meeting, Trump did something unprecedented. Instead of starting with policy directives or economic updates, he addressed each cabinet member personally, one by one, asking how their families were doing. Initially confused, then gradually appreciative, the members opened up more than ever before. It fostered an atmosphere of unexpected vulnerability and honesty, transforming a once rigid formal meeting into a genuine dialogue. When Vice President J.D. Vance asked about this new approach, Trump admitted, "I used to think being a leader meant showing everyone you had all the answers. Now I understand it means knowing how to ask the right questions, and truly listening to the answers." News of Trump's subtle shifts eventually reached the Vatican, though Pope Francis never publicly acknowledged his influence. However, one evening, a private note arrived at the Vatican office. Its message was simple: leadership is most meaningful when it sees and serves those who cannot repay you. Remember this always. Trump kept the note neatly folded in the notebook he had begun using to jot down his thoughts. Each evening, after long days filled with decisions and demands, he opened that notebook and quietly reflected on the day's events. Over time, his notes evolved from lists of meetings and accomplishments to quiet observations, small moments of gratitude, humility, and sincere questions he wanted to keep pondering. One late evening, Ivanka visited him again. Seeing her father's open notebook, she asked cautiously, "Has the Pope's question finally given you an answer?" Trump paused thoughtfully before responding. "Maybe it didn't give me an answer. Maybe it just taught me to stop asking the wrong questions." Ivanka smiled, recognizing her father's newfound wisdom. "Sometimes that's the hardest part," she agreed quietly. This concludes our narrative journey. I trust you found this gripping saga of intrigue, cutting-edge innovation, and astonishing discoveries captivating. From where are you tuning in today? I'm curious to learn which corner of the globe this tale has touched. If this escapade held your interest, please give this video a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel for a steady stream of compelling, mind-expanding stories just like this one. Fresh material is posted frequently, ensuring you're always in the loop for the newest spellbinding adventures. Be sure to pass this video along to your loved ones and friends. It's a great way to share positivity and insight while expanding our circle of story enthusiasts. Your encouragement is invaluable. Thank you for joining me, and I look forward to welcoming you back for the next tale.